Back in. All right, I think we're good. There you go. All right, good afternoon, everybody, on this beautiful wet day. Go ahead and call the meeting to order. Everybody's here. We'll remind everybody there is a sign-in sheet at the back of the room, so if you could sign in for us, please, that would be helpful. We'll go ahead and open the meeting to public comment. Anybody who's got something to say, please come forward.
Good afternoon. My name is Charles Messina. For the record, I live at 4975 Curlew Drive, St. James City, Florida. Traveled a little ways to come here. I want to stress the idea that I'm not politicking. I come here to introduce myself to you as a candidate for the House of Representatives here in Florida, and reaching out to you and hoping that you would reach out to me on your important issues of your water quality here, and these water issues that are very important to our environment. Everyone is very well knows that most of our business and commerce here is based on tourism, and having a clean environment, clean drinking water is paramount to our fiscal and commercial livelihoods here in this area. So I just want to introduce myself and ask everyone if you have a business card that I can get one at some point in time. And hopefully you will reach out to me and share with me your concerns in the fortunate event that I may represent you someday. So I thank you very much for your time.
Thank you. There'll be public comment at the end as well. Anyone else for public comment? All right, we're going to move on to approving the minutes from last meeting. Do you have any comments on those minutes?
I have one. Colin, can you pull your mic up? I've read through the minutes, and the only comment, there were some other things I'm sure will be pointed out, but the only thing I wanted to mention was I made mention of, in the presentation we watched, I made mention of some green rectangles that were on the screen that we couldn't figure out what they represented, and it says in here green triangles. It's not an important issue, but that's the only thing I want to comment on.
Good, in case anybody ever goes back and looks at the map again.
Or is that a comment on English or geometry?
Geometry.
Anyone else with comments? I've got a couple, but not that important. All right, on page 3, in the third full paragraph, it says the P&E study. It's a PD and E. That's not that big of a deal. Page 5, in the fourth full paragraph, it says he is also talking about Craig Smith. He is also a professional Renton scientist, credited by the Society of Renton Scientists. I think it was supposed to be wetland. So he's a professional wetland scientist accredited by the Society of Wetland Scientists. Page 6, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. In the sixth paragraph, the second sentence talks about minor plantings keyed to stabilize its eye slopes. I don't think Apple has a new product yet. I think that's supposed to be side slopes. Page 7, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. The sixth paragraph, second line, it talks about its nomenclature is based on the currencies of this particular unit. I think it's occurrence of this particular unit. Page 8, the first full paragraph, the last line. He stated why they pump water up in water towers, because we impart a gradient as opposed to it's part of a gradient. So we impart a gradient. That's really all I had. Anyone else with anything? We get a motion to approve them as amended?
Approval.
Cullum, second?
Second.
All right, all those in favor? Aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? All right, got that out of the way. Kevin Irwin. Good afternoon, Kevin. How are you?
Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. It's good to be back,
All right, good to have you.
and it's raining, finally. Anyway, one of the things that I want to address with you today is we're coming to very close to the conclusion of the first task in the first phase of our work, and that's the synthesis of some of those reports that you all have had the pleasure of reading through as well as I have. That final report will be due, will be in your hands the end of this week. So I'm going to talk about that a little bit this afternoon as far as what I think we found, what we didn't find, which is important as well. And then in a couple of weeks, you'll have the bulk of the first phase of the work completed, and that's the mapping effort and some of the recommendations that we're going to provide to you. So if it's okay, I'll go ahead and dive into a bit of a summary of the reports. I'm sure by now you've gone through many of these documents as well. Over the last 25 years, there's been at least 20 studies in and around the Bonita Springs DRGR area. And they have covered all topics for the most part, except for one. They've covered hydrology, geohydrology, engineering of various types, utilities, economics, density, zoning, planning, and there's some good information in those reports, some very good information, especially if you decide to take the next step, which is actually constructing a model, because there's a lot of really good information there on the existing infrastructure within the city, and particularly within your DRGR area. That said, there's almost no information on the local ecology. There's very little information on the surface hydrology, and that's what many of you have been taking a lot of time in your meetings discussing. Some of the recommendations that you're going to get from us are how to use the various information that's contained within those reports to your benefit, and some of the ways that you can fill in the information gaps that we believe you need to be looking at in order to be able to make your recommendations to the City Council as far as the future of the Bonita Springs DRGR area. Personally, I think that it will be good to move from those reports in a very positive way towards planning for the future, taking that information that's available in those reports, understanding that there was never really a roadmap, so to speak. When you started collecting that information and those reports were drafted, they weren't done for the most part in a way that one could build on the next. We can do that now after the fact. Is we can do the best job we can to try to tie them together. But there was never, an ultimate plan when they were commissioned, so that we would end up at a time like today with the information that we need to be able to advise our elected officials on how to make good, smart, sustainable land use decisions. The big information gap is water, surface water, wetlands. The detailed mapping that you're going to receive from our firm here in a couple weeks, it'll be the first time that you've ever had any information like that to that kind of detail. It will allow you to, look at face value what is on the landscape. And by face value, I mean that you might see land use as different types of wetlands, but you still don't know how much water is contained within those wetlands because we don't have any data. There has not been any kind of systematic data collection within that part of the city that would tell us what the functional state of those wetlands are. And you shouldn't feel like you're alone, because more often than not, when I do these watershed studies around the world, that is one of the key pieces of information that's lacking for a variety of purposes. Everything from not wanting to spend the money to not feeling like it's important, and really being focused on other micro issues instead of looking at the big picture. One of the few studies that we found that did have some hydroecological data associated with it was a part of the South Lee County watershed study, where one of my colleagues, Brian Winchester, an ecologist I've worked with for more than 30 years, Brian actually collected a bit of that kind of data, but unfortunately it's outside of our study area. It's up on the north side of the DRGR in an area that I think we refer to as Edison Farms. But and I'm sure you had a chance to look at that when you were reading through that study. That's some of the kind of information that we would be wanting to have in our DRGR area. And that wasn't very sophisticated, what Brian did. It was just common sense as far as, looking at indicators on the landscape. He didn't put any wells in the ground. He didn't do any surveying. But I'm pretty optimistic that this is something that I think is doable. It doesn't require a lot of effort, but it does require some effort. And it is somewhat a time-sensitive issue, because we're just starting the 2014 wet season. And you actually have time to do something about it now, just by, some type of an organized effort to go out on the landscape and collect data that will help you in the future, whether you decide to pursue the next phase of this work or not. You need to really do that, in my opinion. And if you don't do it this wet season, you can start during the dry season, but you've missed, another wet season for another year. So that's something that hopefully we'll have a good conversation about, if not today, at another meeting. But when I look at these studies, and I look at the detailed information you're going to get, from us here in a couple of weeks, I'm pretty optimistic as far as the potential that exists for you to have some choices to make and some advice to pass along to the city council. There are opportunities out there on the landscape. It just depends upon what you get out of making the investment, either in purchasing a piece of land and doing some type of restoration on it. But some of the restoration that I see out on the landscape that's needed is very simple. It's hydrological restoration. It's not sexy. It's not building wetlands. It's all about taking advantage of the capacity that you have to store water and actually storing water in that tank, so to speak. And some of it is not that hard to do, but it does take some planning on the city's part to be able to have something that works, that's affordable and sustainable, and gives you what you want when you've completed it. So that's about all I was prepared to say at this point on those reports and how we're using them, and I'd love to have your questions.
Go ahead, Nicole.
Well, just in going back to the issue of kind of the surface water and how we get that right, it seems like there are a lot of opportunities on parcels that are in public ownership already. the Jefferson Flowway, which we're going to be talking about in a few minutes. Kind of the framework of that has already been put together, and so it seems like we do have the opportunity to look at what's out there and come up with something that can be pieced together to really make an appreciable difference in how that area functions from a surface water perspective. So I think that there are some good opportunities, and be looking forward to seeing what you've come up with, and then talking more about how we can put in place some of the elements that are out there to make it make sense and make it work.
Bonita Springs is in a really delicate geophysical location, okay? It's a coastal city, and it's got the sea on one side, and it's got a mountain of fresh water on the other side. And you've got sea level rising on one side that you have to deal with. And you have the undependable nature of climate change on the other side, affecting the fresh water supply from the east. And again, annual rainfall may not change a whole heck of a lot to any significant extent in the next 25 to 50 years, but its delivery will change significantly. So you're looking at, more peak events where having that storage and the ability to pass the water that you've stored through the city is going to be absolutely critical. And your outfall is becoming smaller and smaller. That's the effect of sea level rise. So, I'm really encouraging you to take this advice and think about it, because I think if you're able to do that, if you're able to understand how the plumbing works, how the surface water actually works now, and what what the potential is in the future for dealing with that, it will be time and money well spent on your part, as far as how the city will be able to deal with these issues in the future.
I have a question.
And that's part of your task too, was to synthesize the studies and because each one taken independently provides a different viewpoint of that specific portion of what they were studying. And what we were hoping you would do is meld all those studies together to help us understand the plumbing, so to speak.
Well, what we're really doing is looking for information in those reports that will help us in task 2. We don't ever do that without doing our homework. But like I said, there's some good information in those studies, but they were not built, they were not constructed, they were not designed to complement one another. They were each done for their own specific purposes, for a specific client or a group of people, you see. And that's not how we like to do comprehensive planning. But that doesn't mean that we just overlook those reports, because as I said, there's some very good information in them, but it's mainly with regard to, I believe, with regard to infrastructure, because the nature of the work, as far as what it told us about our landscape out there, was very limited, very, very general. And some of those studies, the better ones, actually referred to, before you make any kinds of decisions with regard to comprehensive land use planning, you need to have a model. You need to collect that data that we know is missing.
I'd like to ask you more about the collecting of the data, and especially and particularly for a time frame. Are you talking about 12 months? Or are you talking about collecting data for 5 years? And who goes about collecting it and where? I mean, do we just stick a couple rain gauges out in various places, or does it? I'd like you to fill in the details on what that.
Yeah, I mean, when we look at how little information that we have, anything right at this point would be good. However, I think we're going to, in a couple of weeks, when you have a report, you're actually going to be able to see the city in a way that maybe you've never seen it before, with regard to where things actually are collectively. And we're going to give you some recommendations as far as where to look, those areas that we believe are important for storing water in the future and for moving water in the future. But it's not, it's not sophisticated when you talk about putting staff gauges in canals, in ditches along the roadside, when you're talking about putting some gauges in creeks and in the river, wetlands, wetlands that we might want to restore, wetlands that the public already owns where we don't have that kind of data. It tells us what's going on there right now, and it will tell us what our opportunities are for storing water there in the future without ever having to buy maybe another piece of land. That's where I would want to start before I started thinking about spending any money. What was, where do I spend it wisely? You see, so you're talking about staff gauges, sticks, metered sticks. You're talking about shallow wells using materials you can buy at Home Depot. I do that all the time. And whether or not you read them manually or you put a recorder on it, doesn't make that much difference for what we're after right now. You know, we want to know where the water is and where it's going, so that, you know, ultimately you understand how the water management system within this part of the city actually works. And that's a good start, you see. And you can actually use that information alone, or you can apply it into the next phase if you decide to do that, and actually putting a model together. You
So
really
is-
don't have that much to do beyond that.
So is that something that we don't leave to the end of, to go to the city to, if this is the start of the rain season? Then is this a recommendation that we take a little earlier to the city council so that we don't miss? I mean, this is kind of an important time of year because we're at the bottom and it's going to start to do its thing. I mean, it's sort of not mid-cycle. It's a good starting or ending cycle.
I think anytime you can start it would be good. And the dry season part of the cycle is just as important as the wet cycle.
Right, I'm just saying that this is
Yeah.
the changing of it, so
Right,
it's
right. But you can always, you know, to answer your first question, an annual cycle would be preferable, to get all of a dry season, to get all of a wet season, so you can see how low it goes and how high it might get. The downside about the little bit of information that Brian Winchester presented in his study was it was done in the fall of 2008 on the heels of a tropical event. So you know, the information he presented was skewed because there was a lot more water on the landscape at that time than we normally have late in the fall at the end of the wet season.
Kevin, what kind of money are we talking about to get it going?
I've thought about this a lot because you're not the first group that I've had to, to make this kind of advice to. And I think one of the things I would be looking to is you get somebody like myself to set it up. It may be a citizen's effort to actually collect the data combined with, the city, managing it might be a way to go. You want to make sure that the information that you collect is good, so quality over quantity at that point. So it is important that it's done right, but it doesn't have to be done by a scientist. It needs to be designed by a scientist. But some of the best work I've seen around the world had local people taking an effort that was actually designed by scientists. And they became part of the data collection effort, and it was a great way for them to make a contribution. It's a great way of keeping your costs down as well. But that would be one of the things I would advise is, it's not something you have to hire a firm. You can hire a firm to do all of the work, or you can hire a firm to, just set it up and then work with a citizens, group that actually helps to collect the data, and maybe the city buys, what equipment that you need for installing the wells. But it's not just you. There's the Lee County DRGR, which sits to your east. Very, very significant. I think you guys need to be forming a partnership, with them as quickly as you can. They need to be monitoring water levels there. The 2020 program has at least 2 parcels I'm aware of within the Bonita DRGR. I don't know that they're collecting any of that kind of data either, and they need to have that in order to be able to manage their property. So it might not be very hard to find partners in that kind of an effort, so that what you do collectively.
We're lucky to have that USGS station right on Kent Road, in the city here. And that is live online all the time. You can get great historical information from that thing too. The historical information, they're very responsive to any questions. They'll send it to you right away, and it's great to watch it live. So that's a big help. But what I'm wondering about, based on some conversations I've recently had, is, as you know, the water from peak dry to peak, let's say average peak low, like, which is over now apparently. I think the rainy season set in a couple of days ago, but that rises. The peak high water day of the year, the average day, I think, is October the 5th. And the change in water level is about 9.5 feet average every year. It's amazing to watch that at my house because I live right on the river, and that station is 50 feet from my property, so it's interesting to watch. But what's the potential? And I know the potential's there, but what's the downside of storing water in these great volume dry riverbeds all over the place, in the Pine Lake Preserve and the Bonita Nature Place area and right over to I-75? There's a high volume of empty riverbeds until the rainy season hits, and then it comes up pretty fast. But
Are you talking about just the channels now?
yeah,
Well-
there are a lot of them on the Pine Lake Preserve. And
I look at the channels as conveyances, all right? That helps us move the water
Yeah.
because we do need to be able to move the water. What that GS gauge doesn't tell you is what's going on with the water level above it within the watershed.
Yeah,
And the way the watershed has been flipped, it was a groundwater-driven system. It still wants to be a groundwater-driven system, but right now, with all the drainage features in it, it pulls the surface water off, puts it right into a channel, and it's out to sea pretty quickly, or as quick as it can get out there, until it's blocked, and then it backs up. So, you know, what we're really looking at, as far as the kind of advice that I'm giving you, that my firm is giving you, is looking at ways to control that, to turn that back around so that we're actually able to store more water on the landscape and release it slowly. And because we have a lot of people living in that watershed now, be able to pass peak events in a safe, smart way. So we can't return it to the way it was back in 1953, but we can do some of the things that are available to us as far as storing that water. So, and that's, Cullen, where I'm talking about doing enough monitoring elsewhere in the watershed so that you know what those antecedent conditions are before it starts to rain. I mean, I was out there today, and the water level's down in a wetland more than 3 meters
Yeah,
below
it's
the
still all the way
surface.
down.
And it shouldn't be that low this time of year, typically, except given the conditions that we have in our landscape here.
But is there any opportunity to store water in there during the peak of the dry season? But then, of course, when it starts raining, it comes up fast, and it's going to be already full.
I think we have a lot of potential, but I think what I would advise you to do is what I have to do, and it's a struggle for me because I've done this for so long that sometimes I'm quick to say, well, let's do this. We should be looking at that. And you really need to take your time and look at the conditions out there. Look at some of the things that we're going to show you in the next couple of weeks, which, whether you agree or disagree, it's going to make you think about what your opportunities are. And there are a lot of opportunities out there, but we have people living on that landscape, and that is going to be the tough nut to crack, is how to be able to do some of these things and also accommodate the people that are living on that landscape. So we're not going to be able to do everything, but I know we'll be able to do some of those things out there if that's your will. There's a tremendous capacity to store water out there. And most of those areas now are not storing water because the water's being directed away from them, you'll see, like those 2 county preserves, all right?
Kevin, about what kind of money would it take if a company organized it, but like you said, citizens under the direction of that company and the city actually went out and did the data taking and put the stuff in place and all that?
I don't think it would be much. I hesitate to give you a price because I know I'll regret it, but I think you'd be surprised how low the number would actually be, especially at the end of this first phase of the work, when we actually know quite a bit about the landscape out there, except what the water is actually doing. You know, we can see where the water should be going, but we don't know if it's actually, to what extent it's being stored, to what extent it's being directed through those.
But is it
those
thousands
areas.
or tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands?
It's thousands. It's not tens of thousands.
Okay.
You see, I think we're, and I really think the best way to do it is to involve the citizens too, because this is not something that you just have to maintain your quality control. But this is in Africa, where it's difficult. I mean, that's the main thing. Get it set up right, maintain QA/QC over the data collection, and then have, somebody that knows what they're doing actually keeping an eye on it and then being there to actually evaluate the data.
Kevin, one of the problems we've had with the operational aspect of our water system, especially the surface water, is we've got multiple jurisdictions. We've got DOT that manages the I-75 crossings. Lee County manages the Kiel Canal. Some private ownership manages certain parts, and then the city manages certain parts, and there's probably others out there too. Water management maybe probably doesn't do much management-wise. Then the same applies to monitoring. So have you then collected from those different sources? And I can understand that maybe nobody's put it all together, because that's what we're having you do. But have you looked at the different sources that are out there from those entities that manage the different aspects of the water resources here, including BSU, of course?
No, we haven't, but that's not really part of what we're doing now. But I got to believe that with all those studies that have been done, most of that information would have been referenced in those.
I guess my question is, do you know that maybe there's not data? I'll give you an example, and it's kind of an embarrassing stat, because at Bonita Bay, the PUD required us to monitor 19 water quality stations. We did that for 20 years, sent it out. Nobody ever did anything with it for 20 years that I was involved with it. And this was on Spring Creek and Imperial River and Estero Bay. And it just sat somewhere on somebody's desk. And so I guess the issue is there data out there that's maybe in that same status that's being taken and just put over here somewhere and nobody's
You're
using
not
it?
the only one that has sent annual reports into the black unknown, because that's where a lot of our work goes, to regulatory agencies, unfortunately. But there are, that's called gray literature. They're technical reports. They're not, sometimes they're referenced by other people. Most of us are careful when we reference that stuff. We don't like to reference it because it may not be properly collected or whatever, but it would be useful to us to be able to, to have that. And there should be a little bit of that out there. I mean, when you look at how Bonita Springs has grown in the last 20 years, it's frightening. I mean, there was a huge change that took place, here since the late 80s, when a lot of development activity took place. There were permits issued for most of that activity. Unfortunately, there's as far as getting your hands on some of that data, it would mean data mining, going through what are now probably electronic files at the Water Management District or DEP, and it may be there, but speaking as somebody that's actually collected that data for people like you, a developer in the past, it was done from a regulatory perspective for permit compliance purposes, not planning. That's why we have so much fragmentation on the landscape, is because we haven't been doing as much planning as we've been doing regulatory, probably. So you're right, that there should be some of that information out there. It would take some effort to data mine, that, and go through the larger projects, some of the PUDs that had a stream going through it or had wetlands on the site, just to see if there was any of that monitoring that was done. But really what we're after, today's conditions, what's happening now, and the development happens so rapidly that I would be concerned that any data that I looked at that was more than 3 years old, I wouldn't want to use, because what we want to do is use the most recent information that tells us what's going on in the landscape right now, what our water is doing, right now.
And as far as this, the Imperial River being the funnel, and you've got the USGS station, and have you verified that upstream, both in the Crew Lands and in the Corkscrew Swamp Sanctuary, I know they've got some monitoring, is that something that you've looked at that's available, or whatever is available, I guess? Because that would be probably the most important part from a large...
Since the last time I saw you, I met with county staff and looked at what they were doing. And there's not a lot of data collection going on in those areas to the east within the Lee County DRGR.
Not even in Crew?
Well, the data that I'm familiar with is data that's done for the well fields, and that's usually, a deeper part of the system that does not, relate all that well to what's going on with surface water. It's like there was really good information in some of the reports that you've reviewed on hydrology, but it's the deeper aquifer hydrology. A geologist might call it shallow, but to a wetland scientist, something that's tens of meters below the surface, that's not really germane to a wetland most of the time.
Yeah, the other thing I've mentioned several times is that just as the monitoring is kind of and management is a kind of a hodgepodge, so is the maintenance, and that the water that was stacked up north of the youth ranch, this way past the end of the summer rains, was due to maintenance of the outfall, or lack of thereof, I guess, because part of it was county, part of it was state DOT, part of it was the city, part of it was private, and actually it just backed up. And so if you could monitor that all you want, but somebody's got to say, here's what was intended for design. It's got to be maintained. So I mean, just another
And that's the
point.
information you have in these reports. I mean, there's some really good infrastructure information on where the bridges are, where all the culverts are, what the inverts are. All that information, for the most part, is available, and that's usually when you talk about doing a modeling effort, which would be in the second phase of this work, that costs the money to produce. And much of that information is already there. What you don't have is ecological information to help calibrate, the model.
Right.
So
I think it's real important what you're saying, because I think that knowing, let me just say this, and I'm sure there'll be people disagree with me, but engineers that go out and design stormwater management for developments, especially in areas like the DRGR, I don't see how they can do it if they don't know how much water's coming in there beyond what falls out of the sky. You can't, the water that comes in by sheet flow and other ways is probably more than drops out of the sky in a season. So therefore, if you don't account for that properly, you can have a stormwater drainage design system, retention system, but you're not retaining and designing for enough water that may get to you. I don't know if I'm making sense or not.
No,
So I'm agreeing with you, Kevin, that what you're saying is important.
Kevin, the report that's coming at the end of the week, what is it going to contain?
it'll contain the information that we believe is missing from those reports that we would want to use in the future. It will contain a summary of what's there that can be used, but we're not going through each study individually and reviewing it and commenting on it. That's not what we're supposed to be doing. We're building upon the next phase of work, which is being able to make recommendations to you.
Right, but you made a comment a minute ago about if it's more than a couple, 3 years old, it needs to be redone. And I'm sure you're well aware, this DRGR area has been studied to death. I think it's going to probably not be taken well if you come in and say, there's really only 2 studies that are new enough to use, everything else needs to be redone.
Scott, that's not where I'm going.
Perfect.
Okay.
Good. That's what I wanted
What
to hear.
What I am saying is, and it's very difficult to go in and talk to a group who's representing a body who spent a lot of money studying something It's difficult to go in and say, well, here's what you have, and this is what you don't have, and this is what I think you need. You know, that's the position that I'm in. I'm not going to back away from that because I think you need to hear what I have to say, all right? And those reports do have some useful information in them. But as far as being something that, if I was a city council person, that I could look at those reports and have something that was really helpful for making land use decisions, not so much. You'll say, I think what we can do is take the information in those reports that's useful, apply, you know, hydroecological information that you collect, and put together a model that's a decision-making tool. I still think that is the way to go. And if I was an elected official, I would want to have my staff with that kind of information to support whatever decision I was going to make. I know there's going to be people that are unhappy when I tell them that, you know, give them that information. And and you'll have it in writing here in another week. But that's the gist of it. And, you know, but we shouldn't be looking back, we should be looking forward, taking what we have that we can use and moving forward.
My concern, I just have to say, if that's okay, my concern is that there are a lot of people's lives on hold. We've got a building moratorium on. We've got more holding. And so it was the reason for my question about asking about the length of time for the data collection. And it's, I think, prudent to take our time, but it's taken a long time to this point. And if we keep coming in with more time to, you know, I just want some idea of the amount of time that we're talking about. And I just hear a vagueness in, with all due respect, in what you're saying that just looks like it's kind of just rolling out there again. And
Well, the chairman was asking me about the studies, the previous studies, and what they meant. That's what I was referring to. As far as the bulk of our work, which is the second part of phase one, you're gonna have the most detailed information that you've ever had on your existing land uses out there and where things are. And it'll have a number of recommendations as far as places to look for storing and moving water within the Bonita Springs DRGR that you've never had before as a result of that. We're taking everything that we can to be able to do that, understanding that, you know, we were not, our contract didn't allow us to collect any data. We're not out there monitoring, you know, water levels, which I feel is important to you before you spend the big bucks, you know, buying another piece of land or involving yourselves in a particular restoration project. That would be my advice, always. You know,
so, but you're not saying all hold, all stop, do nothing
no,
until?
of course not.
Okay.
No.
Kevin, there were some studies that did build on each other, the 99 watershed, the 2009 and 11, and then, of course, the city's 2010 stormwater management plan, which identified the basins, and then the 2011 stormwater management plan that identified the same parameters for water quality improvement as did the BMAP prepared by DEP. Does your recommendations and analysis include at least the fact that we do have master waters management plans that were adopted by the city and by the district and helped funded by the district? I mean, do you throw those out, or do you say, hey, that is a building block? Is our
I
water
don't look at
management-
it as a reliable building block, Dennis, because of the lack of data some of those reports were founded on. They did what they were supposed to do, but they were not, you know, documents that we could use right now for comprehensive planning purposes because of the lack of you know, hydrological data, surface, you know, what we call hydroecological data. That's what's missing.
So you're saying our stormwater master plans that are adopted by the city are not valid, or, I mean, what?
I'm not saying they're not valid. I think they would be well served to have data, you know, collected on those areas that I'm saying are missing, so that they can be updated. All right, so that they are more useful as far as where to issue a permit, where not to issue a permit, and where you want to engage with future development practices in the city or restoration, you say.
Oh, and one question for the chairman. Are we going to, the report in the studies, whether it's after the maps or after, are we going to then be able to chance to receive and interact with Kevin and his
I'd certainly
people?
hope so. I mean, I think part of the reason we scheduled you for today was we anticipated getting these, your phase one, whatever it was, task one, that report before now, so.
'Cause we need to
It's
schedule that,
actually,
yeah.
it's due on the 6th, and you'll probably get it on the 5th of the 6th.
But we would need to
This is-
schedule that, I think, in a meeting, and whether that's the next one, which I think we've got committed, or the one after that, we need to certainly have a,
Right, and I think John and Kevin could coordinate schedules for that.
And actually, that's one of the things I wanted to touch on later on, while we talk about the future meeting schedule, to see
Right.
how we might be able to
Right.
mix and match a couple of those things.
Perfect. And when do you anticipate, Kevin, the second task, so the more detailed report? You said a couple more weeks after the first part? Okay.
I think it's.
So maybe by the time we have you back, we'll
I
have
believe it's
everything.
2 weeks from today.
Okay, so we'll have everything by the time we have you back. Okay,
Okay,
very good.
all right.
Thanks.
If I can just, based on what I'm hearing, I don't want to presume too much, and I certainly don't want to put myself ahead of where the task force might be. But let me just see if I can't address some of Tori's concerns in particular, and that is that obviously the game plan is for the task force to start to, at some point, whenever you're comfortable, articulate recommendations. Those will then go to the council for their action or consideration. Some of those recommendations are going to be focused on policy. Some of those recommendations might be focused on actual projects. Go do X, whatever that might be. And again, we talked about trying to plug as much information as we could into those recommendations in terms of approximate cost, who would be responsible, timetable for getting it completed, those types of things, when possible. While that process is going on, at one of the previous meetings, you kind of fast-tracked one item, and I thought Phil Flood might be here today to talk about whether or not he needs a letter of support for us for funding that he's looking for at this point for some of his projects. But the point is that you kind of fast-tracked one of those recommendations to say, look, if that's time critical, maybe we can kind of put that forward to council in advance of some of these other things. Again, not that I want to pull stuff out of context, but if there was a reason to, you were considering that. And along those lines, I think if it's okay with the task force, I might start looking into what the city's options are in terms of getting more data on surface water, in terms of what are our options in terms of who can design it, what are our options in terms of who can collect it, what are our options in terms of who can analyze it, and more importantly, I think than those three pieces, is who else might be doing something similar now, and reach out to county, to natural resources at the county, water management district, crew folks, and see what pieces might be out there now that we may not be aware of. So again, I don't want to presume to fast track a recommendation, but it sounds like that might be one of the things that could be time critical. If we can get more comfort about what's going on out there now during rainy season, great. If we can fast track something to get it in during this rainy season, even better. I don't want to promise that it can be done, but I've got it on my to-do list if that makes sense to you.
I
Yeah,
think that's fine.
yeah.
well, and I assume that you would also get with Kevin to say, you know, because I think you have ideas of where some of that might be missing or needed, right? I
Mhm.
mean, so, yeah.
And we have people from the city here today that can, from the Public Works.
Public
I mean,
Works,
Yeah, right.
Going to bring them up next, I think.
Well, and
We'll-
I also wonder if we should, not yet, so people watching, not yet, make a call out to citizens who might be interested in gathering the data too. So maybe how that
Right,
looks.
those are the options on collection.
Right. So don't call me, call you type thing.
Not yet.
Not yet, yes, not yet.
I would say some of those locations are very hard to get to, too. I mean, even when I was talking, you know, some of these are very hard to get to.
Understood.
Yeah, going with what Scott said, I know of at least 3 or 4 citizens, I know Colum knows them, that not only are interested, they live out in the DRGR, they have vehicles that are designed to get into some of those places where ordinary cars don't go in. And I think we should pursue that because, and it is getting wet, and I think the opportunity is upon us to start doing something.
I'll see what I can do about putting some of those pieces together.
And some of that land is private property, too. We can't just go cruising on there without, it has to be willing participants of property owners as well.
Yeah,
Maybe we can get badges.
But
Can
the
we get
good thing
badges?
about what Scott proposed and what I'm talking about, it's like some of these people know people because they've lived in the DRGR, and whereas they might turn the city down, they might let that person put a stick in a ditch or whatever, so. Doesn't mean it for sure they would, but I think you got a chance anyway.
I agree, yeah. Well,
Good, thanks.
Before we move off of Kevin's presentation and your discussion of Kevin's presentation, Kevin, did you want to talk a little bit about the council meeting coming up? I know we changed plans at the last minute, or I can talk about it, whatever. Well, originally we had, at least I had thought that Kevin would also be presenting to the city council later on this week, Wednesday, at their meeting. Kevin had, when we first signed the agreement with him, proposed an initial contact meeting with the council that would be by way of introduction, what he was doing, who he was, and to get some input from them about any particularities that they might want to add to or have him consider. Because of various scheduling issues, that never happened. We did have him penciled in for Wednesday's meeting, but at that point, Kevin and I talked about it. It didn't make a whole lot of sense to have an introductory meeting then, since he's about a week away from delivering a product, nor did it make sense for him to go to them to deliver an update on the project, since obviously, as you just heard, he doesn't have something that he feels is ready to be dispersed. So we've taken that off of the council agenda. I will make the same explanation to them, I guess, Wednesday night, because I think at least some of them were expecting it. And then we'll leave it up to Kevin as to, after he presents back to you on the results of both phases of the scope, whether or not then that results in another presentation to council or not. So we'll take that from there.
Excellent. Do we want to have Matt or whoever's going to do the Jefferson Flowway? I see the,
Well, actually, I asked Matt to
or
be
should
here.
we just talk about it first?
Yeah, I asked Matt to be here in case there were questions
Oh, okay.
about his involvement with it. You see some of his comments, obviously, already. And I think, not to steal his thunder, but I think what Matt is trying to relay is that it may not be as obvious, it may not be as easy to put together as some people might have felt. Intuitively, you look at certain things and say, well, this should be able to work. Unfortunately, sometimes when you get down into the weeds of it, literally, it becomes a different story. So obviously, Matt's here for input if you want, but we'll turn it over to you.
and I had asked you to put the maps up, those maps, and I have about 2 or 3 minutes worth of stuff I want to point out with the laser pointer on there, just to clarify that, since I live
wanna do
right
that?
there.
Why don't you
and
do that?
I've been living right there on that map, and,
Have we got a laser pointer for you?
I don't yet, but I want to walk over there and,
Here you
yeah.
go. Here's this, and here's the laser pointer.
Do we have a laser?
I think there's one over there somewhere.
Laser point.
You can use this one too, although yours.
Do we have one?
We have no lightsabers, so. But there should be a laser pointer. Audrey, can you?
Why don't you turn the lights down though a little bit, so you can see better what he's doing.
What do you need?
Laser pointer.
I don't think we have one. This,
No, the clicker.
you see it?
Don't burn your retinas.
Oh, no.
You just flipped it.
You got the, now you,
Got the
now
pointer,
you
but
messed
now
the
you
slide.
flip it.
Don't let Audrey press button. It's like doing math.
Okay, it doesn't make them actually destroy them.
We don't let the lawyer do math.
Smart.
Okay.
All right, don't forget to use the microphone.
Okay, what I wanted
Dude.
to mention regarding these maps in this area, let me just point out a couple of quick things, and then we'll know for sure that we all at least have some of this in mind. Notice these lines that angle down toward the bottom of that map. That's obviously going southwest. It's interesting to see how the trend of the water over eons, of course, the darker areas on the maps there indicate slightly deeper water than the areas next to them, slightly not as deep, and most of them are oriented toward the southeast. That's the way the water generally tends to sheet flow in this area. So just knowing that, my greatest concern that I wanted to talk about is I'm particularly concerned with water quality, and this area right here is an area where water tends to, speaking generally, the water tends to stack up right here in this intersection. That's Terry Street, as you can see, in Bonita Grand. The water that flows due south on Bonita Grand in great volume every rainy season, if we have a normal rainy season, there's a tremendous volume of water that flows down the ditch, which is on the east side of Bonita Grand here, enters the Imperial River, which is the Kiel Canal back here, but enters the canal right here, totally unattenuated, full of trash, whatever it picks up coming down there, and just dumps right into the Imperial River with no attenuation at all there. The same thing happens to a lesser degree on the other side of the road, but primarily the ditches on the east side. The other great amount of water that flows along Terry Street flows due west, right here on the north and south side but particularly on the north side of Terry Street. And on the south side, it flows into the ditches on both sides of Kent Road. But the amount that goes down the road here into a canal that runs right here, where the pointer is, same thing again, totally unattenuated and a tremendous amount of water. So what comes down Kent Road right here has an opportunity to enter the Jefferson Lane flowway right here, although it can't now because it's blocked. But that's the idea, is to get the water into this ditch right here and into this big triple box culvert right here. So that would help, because this water would attenuate somewhat going through this extremely windy Jefferson Lane flowway. And then
Microphone.
it drops in, pardon?
Microphone.
Oh, excuse me, yeah. And then it drops into the Imperial River right here.
Cullum,
Yes.
the property that I'm very familiar with the water you're talking about that flows on the east side of Bonita Grand down and heads, it rushes down there.
Yeah, tremendous.
But that property to the east of Pine Lake Preserve, on the east side of Bonita Grand, is publicly owned by Water Management I think it's actually,
Most of it's 2020 property.
yeah. So I've often felt that water should be being held and worked on that side of the road rather than them having it slope so it goes into that canal or that ditch and then just
Okay,
goes
well-
straight down. So
But I want to go ahead with this. Yeah, I think that's probably a good idea, and I'm sure we'll get to that. But I'm not to the punchline here yet.
right, but
So
that might
what-
be a
what-
parking lot since we're looking at the map, right, John?
Yeah.
Okay, what we can do right here, one thing we can do is, I realize that the Pine Lake Preserve portion of this Jefferson Lane Flowway project could turn into a fairly long project. It's quite involved. In the meantime, we can eventually, hopefully, get a lot of this rapid, high-speed, high-volume water onto Pine Lake Preserve, which needs more water. They want more water, they need more water, and hopefully we can do that. But in the meantime, we can run it down Kent Road. We could run it all, whatever we want on Pine Lake Preserve, we could run all that down Kent Road for now, run less of it on Terry Street, and less of it over here into the river unattenuated, and run more of it into the Jefferson Lane flowway for now, and get that done. Ultimately, we could, rework the calculations and put less of it on Kent Road and more of it in Pine Lake Preserve, but we definitely do want more water on Pine Lake Preserve according to their management plan, and that's one way to go about doing that. And that's all I wanted to mention on the maps for right now. And there is one other thing I want to read off of a little document I have. And who gets
Oh, yeah.
There we go.
Matt, would you mind talking about the Pine Lake Preserve issue and?
There's one other thing I want to mention
Oh,
on here, and then I'm
okay.
done. This, in reading the Jefferson Lane flowway information online, there is one erroneous statement in there that I think we really need to correct because it's very confusing. And it says on page 3 of the Jefferson Lane flowway document that we have online on the city's website, on page 3 of the Jefferson Lane flowway restoration analysis, item 1.2 says, and I quote, "Currently, the Kiel Canal functions as the area's major east-west flow conveyance to the Imperial River via box culverts under I-75." And that's just completely wrong. That Kiel Canal water doesn't go anywhere near those box culverts. The box culverts are the ones up there on I-75, about a half mile north of where they seem to be thinking it is. But that's important to know that, because that water doesn't go anywhere near those box culverts.
And am I right in, based on what you just finished before, is that the east-west conveyance that they're talking about that does go into those culverts is actually East Terry?
No, it's actually the Jefferson Lane flowway culverts, but yes, it comes
East
off,
Terry,
it's the
down
one
and
that
down.
comes off of Terry now.
Right.
But the one right where the Jefferson Lane flowway red line on the left map over there, right there, that's where the culverts are. There's a red
Yep.
line on the map that you have.
East-West Imperial goes under a bridge, not
Yeah, the
culverts.
east-west Imperial goes under a big bridge with natural sides, natural contours. It's not it's just a river with a bridge over the top of it. It's huge. But this red line here on this map shows where the box culverts are. Thank you. There's the pointer. if you need.
So you just want a description of what this?
Yeah, I mean,
could
I don't
be?
know if you've had discussions with Lee about the 2020 lands and what they're planning to do with the Pine Lake Preserve property.
From what I understand, it's still up in the air. What you can see, they've been reluctant to allow us to continue Cullum's Trail to the eastward because they've been talking about possibly maybe rehydrating a portion of the river and taking some of this severity out of what was dug with the Kiel Canal, which you can see in the picture. As I pointed out in the email correspondence, the flowway does appear to be right through here. You can see it in some LiDAR images, which are not shown up here, that kind of show you the flowway and gives you an idea, and you can match it then with some of the historical photographs. Some of the issues here, yes, it exists. Yes, it was severed. No, it is not in public hands. So, in order to place water in there, we would need some form of right, either through an easement or through a taking, and those processes are not typically quick or inexpensive.
You mean the portion of the Jefferson flowway is not in public? Right, okay.
In here.
All right.
Now, one lot is owned through DOT. As you head to the south, the portion that's shown in the red actually connects to the box culverts that Mr. Hasty was referring to that are in existence. We would most certainly have to convey that water if we did rehydrate it with the permission of DOT through basically the corners of their drainage ponds for I-75. So we would have to work with them on a permit modification for that storage area and figure out how to design it and construct it at expense. Yes, sir.
And one thing that might be of interest is that everyone except for one parcel, everyone else except for one parcel, has in concept agreed with the idea. I mean, we haven't shown anybody details yet, so, we don't have details yet. But
Yes, and most, not to counter, but Shangri-La Road was very similar. Most of the folks agreed in concept, but we still did have to go through a taking process and reimburse them.
Excuse me, Matt, could you talk, you sent an email back on the 27th?
Yes, sir.
You suggested there's another alternative to the Jefferson Flowway that's further south.
I think a lot of this plays into what Mr. Irwin is speaking to and what will come out of his work. It's just intuitive to me in looking at this, as well as some of the LiDAR is an elevation imagery. It's basically they flew the plane over Florida and shot a laser, and they know the elevation. So elevation changes show up in shadow, not unlike in a regular old picture, but they show up a whole lot clearer.
Is it that one?
Yep, there you go.
No, I have it here on the
Oh.
computer. We can show you. But what you see here is this is what was the Jefferson Flowway. I can't hold my hand steady enough, but this little area here, this is essentially the ditches that Mr. Hasty was referring to that run along I-75, so they kind of reshape the way things work. And eventually kind of connected, once you get underneath the interstate, this portion almost remains in its natural state. You have to go across the interstate to see it, but you can drive back in that neighborhood and you will find it. You'll find mature cypress trees in that area. The other branches of the Imperial were modified in various ways. You can see that the southern branch was dug and became the Kiel Canal, obviously conveying water a whole lot quicker than it probably ever naturally did from the east. But you also had these other branches, and they're a little more significant. When you look on the LiDAR imagery, you'll see that they're a little more significant in terms of volume than what you have here in the Jefferson. Not to say that it's not a good project, but the reason I kind of focus on that is when you're talking about water quality, you traditionally want to hold water back and let it migrate into the soils to be treated. And so if you're looking at something which may be counterintuitive to a conveyance, if you will, but if you're looking to store some water in those conveyances year-round, obviously the more volume you have, the better. The conveyance I was referencing that looks like it may be a candidate actually does take water in high rainy season. Last year, the water backfed it, and the reason I know all this is because it's right at the head of Cullum's Trail. If you go to the trail, the very first bridge is actually this piece of the Imperial River right here. This piece is almost completely gone. You can't find any remnant, but it's this piece right here. The trail actually runs along the Kiel Canal for the most part, but that has some significant capacity in it and was obviously one of the historic areas.
Matt, is that 1258? Is that a 1958 photo?
I for sure thought it was 62, but I had several photos that I used to kind of come up with these images, and I know a real good one in 62 shows this. This may be 58. It probably most likely is December 1958.
That's what I wondered, because I always read that the Kiel Canal was dug in the 1960s, and that map says 58 on it.
I noticed that one. I'm sorry. I had images from the county and images that I downloaded from a site, but
Is that a composite, maybe, that map?
no. It's an aerial tile. I can
Then it
show you
really-
where to
then
find
it
it.
must have been dug in 58, or, pre-58 then, obviously.
Assuming 1258 means that. If I go back to my computer, I can tell you exactly what image it is. I apologize, I don't have it.
May I jump in here, Matt? I've been, in my reading, I've seen, 4, 5, 6, 7 years ago, they're talking about the Jefferson Flowway. How many years have gone by and we still have not got off the dime and implemented something? What's the driving factor that's holding the project up? And what about the other alternative you're suggesting in your email? Seems like another logical way of proceeding. Next part. Can we talk dollars and cents somewhere along this conversation?
All right, we'll start with the next part, because I think it answers the first part. And I've been here about a year and a half, 2 years, and the report that we have on the Jefferson Flowway is very much conceptual in nature. That's just what it is. It's conceptual. It does not get you from here to there. Probably what's held this up, and this would be my estimation, is the takings that you would need to do to put the water on this piece of the Jefferson Flowway. In addition, the conveyances that you'd have to construct on the FDOT ponds will be significantly expensive and require significant coordination.
Matt, have you got any idea of the dollars at all? mean,
I do not.
2 million, 3 million, 1 million? I mean,
We need to have money.
I think what you could do a whole lot more, less expensively, is to try and hydrate this portion that may have a little more capacity.
And who owns that portion?
Let me get you another image.
Kevin, did you have something, by the way?
I know you guys really want to do something. But where you're working down at the bottom is the most difficult place to work in a watershed, okay? Especially when you don't know what's above you, okay? And, you know, Colin did a really good job describing, you know, where that water is coming from, but what he didn't mention is the large ditches that are alongside the road. The cross-sections are pretty significant. There's a lot of water that moves through there. That means that water's coming out of these wetlands here that Matt is
What's going
showing
on?
you. Okay, well, it's coming from this area, all
Right.
right?
Right.
This is the first area you work on. Then this, okay? You should have a plan for the entire area, taking a regional approach. You look at this basin, you see. So, I mean, the poor engineer that's trying to come up with a concept down here without being able to look at this area is really hamstrung.
Right, but we don't always, I mean, if it's 2020 land and it's water management land and it's Lee County land,
So, that's a good thing. Those are partners.
Yeah,
Okay.
let me mention one other thing about that volume of water that it worked for me back when in around 1999, right before we became a city. I was already fiddling around with this Jefferson Lane thing, and I went to see Ray Judah with a photograph. I said, Ray, I want to show you how much water is going down this ditch on the side of Bonita Grand here. And I took a photograph I think it was in September. I don't remember which year, but I may have taken it a few years previous. But the point of the photo was showing how much the water was climbing a standard telephone pole. It was a standard sized phone pole, about like so, and the water was climbing up the pole about 1.5 feet going past it. I mean, that's how much volume it had. That's how fast it was. It was really, for a still photograph, it did a real good job of showing how heavy the volume of water was. So, yeah, it's tremendous in there. I mean,
I mean, what Matt's saying is true. I mean, there just was not a lot of water historically that went through that conveyance that you're calling the Jefferson Lane flowway.
yeah, I believe
It's an
that.
ephemeral stream, meaning it's dry more often than it's wet. And most of that water in this area stayed on the landscape to the east. It just stayed there. And it would build up hydrostatic pressure and it would leak out through the sand. If you've ever walked around out there, you see how sandy that substrate is. And it would find its way into the depressional areas, the wetlands, and it would find its way down into the small feeder channels of the Imperial River. But, you know, those are not giant streams out there, so
Right,
they
but-
they've never really handled the kind of quantity of water that maybe you're thinking about putting in it now. So, you know, really, just to be able to store water, start talking to the Water Management District, start talking to Crew, start talking to 2020.
that's what I was just going to say, is that water management right now, Phil's trying to get that funding together so that they can change the canals out there on the land that they took and haven't been able to stop draining all that water so fast. So
The Kiel Canal is an opportunity. You know, we've talked about it being a problem as long as I've been here for 40 years, you know. But now it represents an opportunity because it's a way to manage the water upstream, but it's also a really good positive outfall downstream. And I don't think the Jefferson Lane flowway is a good positive outfall because of all the things you're talking about with the
And
people living there. And the first thing that you have to consider when you're restoring water back on the landscape is being sensitive to the people that are out there. So you're going to have to be doing some things like berming and putting in swales so that the water does not become a problem for the
I have
public
to
that's
admit, in
there.
defense of that project, my main concern when I first thought of it, and really even now, was how much I hate to see a beautiful, windy, natural cypress, and, you know, a river that's full of big cypress trees, giant oaks, which are in there. I hate to see it cut off from its water, you know? And I was more concerned with the habitat, the critters, and the water quality in that general area. I wasn't looking at it as conveyance for a lot of.
No, and I think if you start to restore the pool above that, all right, the water table comes up.
Yeah.
All right, and you're gonna have water going through that channel again. You're gonna have water coming down to the south again. It's gonna obviously take some engineering because of the people that are in the area right now to make sure that you separate the people from the water. But this is a huge opportunity. All I'm saying is that, you know, the sequence needs to be different. You
I'm
need to
all
be
for whatever
working-
works,
Working at storing that water above it so that it gently enters, you know, the point of discharge.
But to Colum's point too, we don't want to sit around waiting and discussing and hoping while the ecological damage is done, and we lose our
I think
opportunity.
it's a good thing that you got crew out there,
Right.
Water Management District.
But he was talking about the Jefferson Lane Flowway,
Right.
for example, is you know all those beautiful cypress trees and that what Matt was talking about, that conveyance, is that what you call it, along Columns Trail is
But
beautiful.
Scott, it sounds to me like the Jefferson Flowway is a dead end.
Well,
And it's got too many
I
problems
don't know.
associated with it. We should take it off the table entirely and press on other matters.
I don't know about that, but John, you have something real quick?
Well, let me just let Matt finish up with a couple, I think, Matt, did you want to show something else?
Yeah, I just
And then-
wanted
and
to
then
show
I'll-
one thing that may help.
Perfect.
I think a lot of what Mr. Irwin's saying really does pertain to all of this. They all seem to really, any of these creeks started no further than maybe Bonita Grand, if you look at the old imagery. Obviously, the water was on the land before that. This is the other piece that I was referring to that's headwater of the Imperial River. You can see, this is LiDAR imagery. The darker it is, the more elevation change or capacity you have. Here's your Jefferson Flowway. It doesn't show up real well on this. This is normally dry in the dry season, and depending on how much rain we get, it can stay dry even in the wet. But this is the area that I thought might make more sense in the beginning to look at. And the reason is everything in green is publicly held land. And so you do have a couple of residences that are over here, but once you get to here, you're in fairly vacant land and publicly held land. So if the board was to look at something downstream, which is probably a little premature, this may be the easier first step and less expensive.
Audrey?
Yes, and I just want to say, in 2007, 2008, we worked on an agreement with Lee County along with their surface water management folks, along with a private developer, Roberts Group. This is an obligation of the developer to realign Pine Lake Preserve. So this is on the radar of Lee County. At this time, that development has been dormant, but I believe that is a zoning requirement that they go forward and do it, and there was an easement provided to the developer from Lee County on the Pine Lake Preserve portion.
Did their permits expire in 2008? I thought I read that Roberts Group was due to expire in 2008.
Well, Roberts Group left the project, and then it became Eagle property. I do not know whether they obtained extensions or anything as to.
It was
the-
Eagles property always.
Right, but it was called Roberts, was the developer at the time, and then
Yeah.
there was the issues
Expired, didn't they,
that we
John?
resolved. But I cannot tell you, I can have John Dolmer look it up to see if
Yeah.
there's been,
That was in our packet a couple
Yeah.
meetings
Yeah, I
ago.
remember
And,
seeing it.
and let me just suggest that whether or not those permits have expired or not, I think the point is more important, that the county is well aware of that opportunity to try to rehydrate the natural flowway there. They are trying to encourage that any way that they can, even to the extent of making it part of the financial obligation of developers in that area. We've been talking to them about how we can partner with them. So those conversations are ongoing.
Yeah.
So, at least what I'm hearing is that, and Dave, this goes to your suggestion about Jefferson flowways. What I'm hearing is that the idea of trying to rehydrate some of these natural flowways has pretty wide support, not only, from various perspectives, let's put it that way, including from our own public works, because obviously it would work better for us for a number of different projects we have going on. some of the options, and we do have options, it isn't just the Jefferson Flowway, so we do have some options. Some options appear to be logistically a little easier than others in terms of public ownership versus private ownership and the dollars involved and where those dollars might come from. But I don't know if I would go as far as to say that you should think about eliminating the Jefferson Flowway from any possibility. Lots of things could happen if the idea is pushed forward, but you have to do it with your eyes open. I mean, there are some issues with Jefferson Flowway that don't exist in the other. Matt talked, I think, pretty clearly about the private ownership issues and what we need to go through to be able to do that kind of a project on private lands. The FDOT conversations that we have, and we have been having those conversations, frankly, have been positive. But understand that from their perspective, what they're looking at is their pond, their conveyances. Their position is we've designed and constructed those with certain capacity, certain quantities in mind. If you're going to be adding to those capacities and quantities, then it implies redesign, reconstruction, and that would be at our cost. So that, again, is where some significant dollars could be attached to the project.
And
I
is
guess
the
what I would like to
interagency?
see some further definition and details associated with this alternative Matt was talking about.
It does seem like, at least on the surface, that it's logistically at least
But
much more viable.
Who can we have to develop the idea further and sort of take it to the end
I'm
game?
assuming that if that becomes one of the recommendations that comes from this group, it'll probably be an internal project.
Is it staff to staff, the internal discussions or interagency discussions?
Mhm.
Staff to staff, good, okay, good.
It seems to me that,
Hold on, Dennis had a
Well,
question.
no, I agree with what John was saying. I think what Matt has pointed out is maybe the low-hanging fruit is that other flowway that's south of it. And that makes sense from a cost effectiveness and timing perspective, but yeah, I wouldn't say take it off the table at all. I think it's still it should be part of the master plan. I understand what Kevin is saying look at the picture, and even in the studies that were done, it was never a project in of itself. It always tied into the Pine Lake Preserve rehydration. So if we take it further east, that's good too, because I think all of that. But it's part of the puzzle that Nicole's talked about. I think the southerly flowway, the Jefferson flowway, all of that should be looked at and the rehydration of the Pine Lake Preserve, and then what happens east of 75 and the Kill Canal. That's just part of the plan, and I wouldn't be as afraid about the issue of public taking of the easements. I think there was one that gets cut off. The others, if they're cooperative, that's great too, but still there would be probably some condemnation required, I expect. But, we've talked about things a lot more scary than that with taking private property and private property rights, for water issues. So this is kind of minor compared to, what some of the other issues we've talked about. So
Yeah.
well, I was going to say,
Yep.
too, that if water management is able to get its funding and do its work, and this idea of Matt's was to be done, it would change a little bit how much water was going to the Jefferson, because I think one of the hard things is that this thing's always evolving, I mean, if somebody fixes this here, then you don't have the same amount. I mean, if we could get 2020 to do something about holding some of that water back, then this idea of it running down the east side straight into the Kiel Canal would alter too, and so the Jefferson would, being so much just a concept, that concept I think would alter a little bit.
Right, Colin?
Kevin, could I ask you a question? You really made me think for a second when you mentioned what an opportunity the Kiel Canal is. Kiel Canal goes all the way out to obviously, almost to Lake Trafford. I mean, it runs way out east.
I've done the whole thing.
Now, let's say that it's as low as the rest of this water gets to be in the peak of the dry season. It's obviously very low, which means there's an awful lot of storage capacity in that also. And that's huge. If you want to talk about a water body that has a lot of room for capacity, it would be the Kiel Canal all the way out to the end of it before it turns north. What's the ramification of filling that up or having it much fuller during the peak of the dry season? What happens when all of a sudden now here comes hurricane whatever in the middle of June, an early one, and it's already wet out there because the water's been high in the Kiel Canal all dry season. Does that adversely affect its ability to do what it's intended to do, which is store water? Well, that's the weir is intended to help us store water behind it. So that all must relate hydrogeologically somehow, I'm sure.
I'm really trying hard not to give you the results before we publish it,
Okay.
but this is probably, I was just telling Matt, this is one of our top 3 projects, but it's not we're not calling it the Jefferson Lake Flowway Project, okay? And it really does begin with the drainage of the Kiel Canal,
Yeah,
okay?
I can see that.
And it's a great opportunity. I don't know that I'd fill it in. I'd take an engineering approach to it so I could actually regulate the water in there. But
Yeah.
if we tend to focus, some of us, so much on that canal, we lose sight of the fact that there are other conveyances. There's one structure on that canal now, but a lot of that water in the wet season just goes around it and ends up in a roadside canal and is shot down. That's shot to the east or to the west, as you were pointing out, and then down to the south, and it just bypasses the structure.
Right.
You see, so there's no way we can get water probably to the 2020 property unless you restore the groundwater table above it. That's the source of water for that area, okay? And when you go out there and look at that, you can really see it. If you look at the historical imagery, you'll see it was wet, but it's not deep. It's not a real deep system, you see. That system to the east was much deeper and held a lot more water. So you guys are on the right track, okay? It's just a matter of putting it together so that I think it really makes sense from an ecological, hydrological, and an economical way, so that you don't want to start at the bottom typically, or you get killed, okay? You start up above and start working your way down the system, and it's also typically the most economical way to do it as well from an engineering perspective. And that's where you need some of this information eventually. And I know you guys are really chomping at the bit, but if you want to make something happen, continue that line of thought, and let's talk about the kind of information that we need from the city, from the other partners, because we've got partners out there on the landscape like the Water Management District, like CREW, like 2020, that all have issues, and the best way to deal with those is collectively, so nobody is bearing all the burden. So, David, I think it's just a matter of opening up the way we're thinking a little bit more, so that that flowway that Matt pointed out historically was far more of a tributary than the Jefferson Lane flowway cross-section was. There was a lot more water that went through that historically, but even that said, it's a relatively small stream with not much of a floodplain along it. So our job is going to be trying to figure out how to store some of that water up above it. And it's not that difficult, because what I tend to focus on are the structures that are already there, the infrastructure, the ditches and the canals that are already there, and how can we re-engineer those so that they suit our present day purposes, you see. And I think that can be done, and I think the Kiel Canal is a good opportunity,
Yeah,
for this whole area.
report that we have online, it mentions rebuilding it 240 feet from where it is right now and
Right.
changing it around a little bit.
And if you'd have to do some grade work in there probably to get the water down to the south and away from some of those people, just to make sure you don't have those kind of liabilities. That's always one of our greatest concerns restoring property is not to have adverse impacts on the adjacent
Do we make
landowners.
this into a parking lot item, and then who's going to flesh out the idea?
I think you'll have something fairly orderly stated in the report that I'm going to
That's
give you
what-
in 2 weeks.
Great,
All
great.
right.
I was going to add the other aspect of the Jefferson flowway that is somewhat unique is that it has its own conveyance under 75, which has been the dam. So I think from a conveyance perspective, it gets us past 75. Now, what happens west of there may not help a whole lot, but still, it's unique in that it does provide this additional conveyance is underutilized crossing 75.
And on the other side of 75 is out of our particular study
Yeah.
area.
Well, but I think Matt said
There-
that actually was a relatively natural, still there.
Yeah.
With
There's
mature
one
cypress.
more advantage of the Jefferson Flowway. It's a conveyance what we've not talked about, and that is that because it meanders so much, almost looks like a snake, that takes the water and it slows down how long it takes to go from A to B,
Oh, definitely.
and that's good. That helps the water quality level, which is another issue.
Nicole?
What is the relationship between the city and the county as far as the 2020 parcels? I know on the one parcel, there was an agreement that as part of a permit, they would do some work. But if the city went to 2020 to the county and said, you know what, we would really like to either move forward with some of these management activities or really take a look at the 2020 parcels, what's your thought as to how open, willing the county would be to maybe give over a bit more control of those parcels?
Well, I don't know that I can speak to the idea of control of those parcels, because if they're purchased with $20, there are obviously certain conditions and restrictions
But
on the
if the
property.
city was doing something consistent with the intent of 2020?
And then the question becomes, when you say county, obviously there are different components and functions at the county level. Our conversations have been with the actual 2020 folks, and it's all been very good and open and cordial. The conversations came about because we were looking, frankly, for grant funding for an extension of the Bonita Trail. We wanted to go further west and further east from what we have now. Further east would have meant through those properties. We have to show as part of our grant application that we have the owner's either consent, permission, or whatever. And while they love the idea of extending the trail, they said, no, at this point we can't give you that permission because here's what we're contemplating doing. And that's when that first came to our attention, that there's this possibility to change the water flow there. Obviously, we have a lot to talk about, but again, that was just the 2020 management folks. I don't know, given the state of their budget discussions and everything, whether or not they're actually ready to move ahead on a project like that. I don't know where it would be in terms of priorities. So I can't speak for the county as an entire entity, but I can tell you that the folks who are dealing with those properties, I think it would be a high priority and one we'd have a great partner with.
And it would be their funding that did it within their,
I assume so. I mean, at that point, they hadn't talked to us about funding any of it.
but I mean, we would be reliant on, in this example, 2020, deciding to put the money up to do that.
And again, I haven't checked recently to see if they're moving ahead on any kind of any project similar to that, given what's been going on with the 2020 program. I don't even think that they know at this point.
Right.
So.
Dennis?
A couple of things. On the 2020, well, actually on backing water up, just as we've heard from the district on the Southern Crew project, they had to buy out parcels to be able to stack the water up a little bit. And I assume if we're saying we're going to try to stack more water beyond the Keel Canal, or that's not already public owned, there are quite a few out parcels in the Crew lands east of Bonita, east of the city limits, that aren't bought. And it would be great if we could get those on 2020's radar screen, because
They are.
For-
They're on.
all,
They're on
there's a
the-
bunch of them, yeah.
They were all pre-approved. We had a special thing where, well, I was on 2020 for 10
Yeah.
years.
Colm, you want to talk into the mic?
Yeah, excuse me. Anyway, they're on the radar screen, but now things are in an uproar with 2020, since I've only been off of it for about 4 months, but now things are in an uproar now.
Yeah, and I guess the 2020, they seem to focus on if you can't access it and make it used for public, they are needed for stacking water, yeah, not for
They-
access.
they want 'em
yeah,
all.
Yeah, okay, well, yeah. Okay. Oh, I was going to say, why don't, if we haven't already done so, the parking lot for the southerly flowway, maybe add that restoration to the list? Okay, great.
Well, and I think we'll talk more about this concept too, and maybe some other parking lot issues after we get the report. Sounds like Kevin has some ideas. Good.
And just let me correct one thing. What I meant, I think I said permit. What I meant was we had all of those 5 and 10 acre parcels pre-approved. They didn't have to go through the process. If somebody wanted to make them available to 2020, they were automatically passed
That
through.
they
for
got
acquisition.
voluntary sellers, so,
But then it's all, everything's changed
yeah,
now.
yeah.
Anyway, that's that.
And thank you, Cullen, for your work on 2020, by the way.
My pleasure, I loved it, it was great being on there.
And thank you, Matt, for your work on this
Yeah.
stuff. So thanks for the information. And
Yeah.
anything else on the Jefferson Flowway? Southern Flowway? All right. Member items and reports? Anything,
One little quick thing.
please?
The one parcel in the Jefferson Lane Flowway area, the one that is not owned by an agreeable property owner, it's owned by a guy who's, I don't even know, I don't know anything about it, other than I don't think I'm not sure he even knows much about the property, but he bought it as an investment years ago. And that one particular piece, you would have to build a bridge to get onto it. Mike, could I ask you a question? You know the parcel of property owned by Marconi on the Jefferson Lane Flowway? The one piece it's a 1.5 acre parcel just north of the McKee property? Same size, it's a 1.25 acre piece of property. You would have to take a bridge to get to it, to get to the property. It's that much of a, it's the most of the property is isolated from all the rest of the properties on that Jefferson Lane Flowway. It would require you to take a bridge onto the property to utilize the property. What goes on with permitting with something like that? If somebody came in and said, we want a bridge, we want to put in a bridge to get to our property. That's the nature of that piece of property.
Who would you get for sitting in the audience?
Mike Kirby, Senior Environmental Specialist for Community Development. A bridge over a natural water body,
Right.
okay? On either side of the parcels, are they wet to begin with, or are they dry?
It's dry on one side.
Uh-huh.
It's dry on the east side, and it gets quite wet on the interior of that property variously. It's oxbows and tributaries, and there are more than one. It's a pretty wet piece of property. The piece is 1.25 acres. I bet at least a half acre of it's wet, underwater in the wet season. At least a half acre.
Well, it sounds like your typical environmental resource permit from DEP or South Florida, one or the other.
Yeah.
And then they would determine the impacts, but the secondary impacts would be more pronounced in this. Usually your secondary impacts is your 25-foot buffer to your wetland. You can figure out your wetland impacts right away, how much you're going to disturb and all this. But with a bridge, that means access.
Well,
that
what I'm
means-
really asking is, what would you be allowed to cut off that flowway and fill it and put in a road? Or do they have to put in a bridge? I mean, it would have to be one or the other.
Oh, you would have to follow their guidelines, avoidance, minimization, and then mitigation. So their first option would be say, well, let's see if we can't avoid that. And then let's say, okay, well, is your plan the best plan? And then they would take a look at that and determine that. And then lastly, would be the plan that you may have in front of you to just put a bridge over there and
Yeah, the reason I'm asking is because someday the owner of the property is going to be deciding what to do with that property, and he's going to find out that it's not very easy to get to.
Right. He has to go through the options first, and, yeah, it has to.
It will become an issue, I'm sure. Thanks.
Thank you, Mike. Dave?
Just one more time for this pet peeve. I'm really disappointed we're not talking dollars and cents with any of these alternatives. It's not our job to find the money for the council, but we need to at least be cognizant of it, at least ballpark numbers. I mean, in my government job, I was used to rounding to the nearest billion. We're holding the rounds those much smaller
This is
numbers.
between 0 and 1 billion.
Yeah. But please, I feel guilty we're not talking about dollars and cents.
Yeah,
on
I
these.
agree.
Well, and to Matt's point, I mean, I think this was conceptual in nature. It wasn't to the point of engineering and talking about, because when you talk with FDOT and FDOT says, okay, you need to triple the size or triple the capacity of our retention pond, and
Who's going to fill in the blank and identify a number?
Well, again, I think we've talked about this before, and at least from staff's position, I would think that we're not doing the best job that we can for the council if our recommendations didn't, to the best extent possible, come with estimated price tags. So that will come at some point, I believe, whenever we can, once we have some hard and fast recommendations. Obviously, again, some of the recommendations are going to be on the policy side, some are going to be on the project side. For those projects, we have some information beyond just conceptual at this point, so that I'll be more comfortable with the dollars. But believe me, I have a feeling that for some of these, it's going to come with a giant asterisk saying totally, estimated, not quite sure, could be way off type disclaimer language, again, because we just don't have it engineered at this point. But my intent is to, wherever possible, to have dollars, timing, and responsible parties as part of those recommendations.
Thank you much.
Just add real quick, from what I understand, is Matt still back there? The CIP that was furnished with one of the ordinance that was adopted recently showed that for this fiscal year, the water management master plan projects were $200,000. Is that pretty much what I'm reading? I'm just putting it in perspective of, because last week we were talking about, or last meeting, there was discussion of priorities of dollars, but stormwater master plan, $200,000 for this fiscal year, is that pretty much?
Yes, that's correct. And to answer your question, Mr. Gallagher, it's not listed in our stormwater master plan. Right now, the thing that we're focused on is removal of nitrogen from the water as we're under the BMAP.
Right.
And that is a fairly expensive undertaking. And just reconnecting a flowway without storing the water does not help us in that undertaking. So the things that drive us are looking for land that we own, that we can use, that we don't have to buy, and that we can store water on or do some sort of project. So this project not being in any of our plans and not really meeting any of those factors and not having the direction to pursue it is really why you don't have a hard and fast number or hard and fast engineering.
But it would be nice if we come up with some recommendations that would help you achieve
Sure.
funding because of the priority we've assigned to these projects.
Absolutely.
Well, I think the reason I brought that up is because the $200,000 for the water management compares to $300,000 budgeted for the dog park. So I'm just saying, it is an issue of priorities of the city council too, on where they spend the dollars for the public dollars. So,
We'll get you more money, Matt.
One other minor point of administrative trivia. We talked last time about next meeting dates.
We'll get to that.
Oh,
We're not there
sorry.
yet.
Sorry.
John?
And I just feel, Dennis, I understand exactly where you're coming from, but I do feel like I have to speak for my counsel that's not here. To a certain extent, that's not really a fair comparison, only because dollars for something like the dog park are taken from park impact fees, which have very limited uses as to what they can be used for. We have to use those dollars to increase our park capacity, so it's not as if they could just move those numbers over. So again, I understand where you're coming from, but sorry, council, just felt like
On that point, though, I think it for me, who has very little knowledge of engineering costs of bridges and putting in new water conveyances under I-75, I can't even begin to guess what those numbers are. But at one point, we might be talking about what a great reservoir the mine would make, no numbers. And now we're talking about this and no numbers, and I don't have a way of comparing those two thoughts or understanding whether either of them is a reality, or is this just a great idea but complete folly. And that's why even when I said to Mr. Irwin, thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, I need some, and I'm sure I'm not alone in this, some kind of even a broad thousands, millions. Otherwise I'm just whistling Dixie up here.
well, again, understanding that the numbers that we put together for you, won't be quoted bid out numbers. They'll be pure estimates. But given that, I would assume that at some point, let's say, whenever, 4 months down the line, 3-4 months down the line, when we have an articulated list coming from the parking lot items of, just for argument's sake, 10 different recommendations, 5 as to policy, 5 as to project, that you would then, as a group, prioritize those projects. And one of the things you're going to be considering is, Should this one at $200,000 be priority one as opposed to this one, which may be a nicer project, but it's a $2 million project? So
Yeah, and John, I guess I see our role more as creating that policy that, and I think the city did a good job in their stormwater master plan update with creating those scoring system for prioritizing projects. And I think we should create a similar type policy, or maybe refine that policy. Price was a determinant factor, but it was not nearly as a strong an indicator of selection as I thought it should be. So maybe we could make the suggestion that policy more strongly favor price, and I think it was a price per nitrogen removal factor that I thought should be.
and that can be one of your policy recommendations.
That's what I mean, but as opposed to just purely looking at price, because something might be less expensive but not as effective, that we would have selected the more expensive project. So I think if we're just, I mean, price is important, but I think it's effectiveness that's ultimately the.
But we're not, I mean, we're really not quite to the point of knowing price, because we don't exactly know what it is that the recommendations are. So I think
Totally agree. I mean,
we
It'll
need
have
the
to come
price,
together.
but I think we're still a few steps away from that.
Well, but Nicole, too, we're not going to have the price for every project we may
Right.
propose. So that's why I think the policy to
Absolutely.
encourage price as a determinant factor for consideration of the council makes
I think
sense.
some of these, we should at least have a range. We may not, I think we could probably, from experts we have available or the staff, come up with, if it's 2 to 4 million or something, it's better than nothing.
I was going to rely on Dave's suggestion of 0 to $1 billion.
0 to $1 billion.
Right.
Down to the nearest $1 billion.
Sign my name,
Somewhere in that range.
write the check.
I did want to just give a brief update. After the last meeting, I had indicated that I had asked George and Bill and the mining team to sit down with Roger Kopp to discuss further this idea of, could the mine be incorporated into a reservoir type system as was proposed by Jim Beaver and the Agency on Bay Management. And our meeting ran fairly late 2 weeks ago.
I had to kick you out.
So, yes, so we didn't have a whole lot of time to sit down and meet, but I did just want to give you feedback from that, and I'm sure George and Bill can, under public comment, add to that. But really, the engineering of creating a reservoir system is something that kind of the water experts, the hydrologists, were batting around back and forth. And if you stack 4 feet of water, what kind of cutoff wall would you need to have? And would it have to go down 40, 50, 60 feet to the bottom of the mine pits? How would that work? If you did 1.5 feet, would it be different? And the outcome was there's still a lot of questions that need to be answered. But in looking at Kevin's work product, which is upcoming, my recommendation was, instead of spending money trying to figure out how that works as a reservoir, let's see what Kevin comes up with, and that could lead to maybe some better ideas for moving forward. And I know that the mining folks are going to be meeting with Jim Beaver tomorrow, I believe, and I know that Jim has some other ideas for how all of that's incorporated. So not a whole lot of results, but I think it was very good to get everyone in the room together to kind of share thoughts and perspectives, and probably something more will come from that later, but looking for Kevin's information first. So just wanted to report out on that.
Good. Looking forward to hear about the Bonita Grand aggregates and aquifer. Any other member items or reports?
Dennis, did you want to mention this?
Oh, yeah, you can pass that out. It's just a follow-up. Since I wasn't here last time, there was reference to the Logan extension, and this is just the summary of what the developer's required to do to extend the road in his second phase, so, which I think you mentioned is probably 3-4 years away, something like that.
Well, I'm guessing it's more like maybe 2 or 3 years
Could be,
now.
yeah,
at
could
this
be
point,
sooner,
but-
yes. So it would be a private developer-funded road up to Bonita Beach Road, yeah.
But would it be more like through Mediterra, or would it be inside the gated?
No, there's a separate right-of-way between the county line and Beach Road, just east of Palmyra.
So it would be public access?
Right.
Anyone?
Yes.
Yeah, okay.
Right.
I was just
Yeah.
You can see it on that map,
Yeah.
just west of Village Walk. the curved line at the very bottom,
Oh, yes.
it would be coming up through
Here?
there. Yeah, I believe that's it, coming up through there.
And of course, that being the best-selling community in Southwest Florida, it's probably going to happen sooner than later, like you're saying.
Good. Staff updates?
Well, again, I talked to Phil Flood about a letter of support. He appreciated the offer and was going to get back to me, and then I ran into him actually again at another meeting up in Lee County last week. We talked about it briefly again, and haven't really heard back from him since. So I have to assume that it's not time critical at this point, but I will keep it on the boilerplate with him, and if he has something that he wants us to be able to do, I'll bring it back up. I'm gathering, though, that the consensus would be that if it does turn out to be something time critical, if it has to go to our council before you guys meet again, I'm gathering that the recommendation would just be that the city council should support whatever it is that they need to try to get funding. So.
I think we as a task force
Gotcha.
Yes.
could stand behind that.
Gotcha. Thank you. That's it.
All right.
There was an indication you might want to talk about rescheduling.
Oh, yes.
Dave?
Well, do we,
I have confirmed I will be on an airplane on the 21st.
Of
July. And
Well, we have June the 16th, and again, I'm going to try to confirm, but my understanding is we'll have Eric Livingston at that meeting. So far, we had July 21st, and then August 11th. I'm still trying to confirm, oh, by the way, I need some clarification. I'm trying to confirm with Brenda from Crew for July 21st. I've talked to Lisa from Big Cypress Basin, and her response was, love to, but why? I think, her position, and I can understand, is that, Phil attends the meetings and has already given a presentation. If there's something specific that you think she can offer about Big Cypress Basin or one of the, something concrete that she can work around, certainly. Otherwise, she thought maybe it would be best to defer to Phil because he's got a wider perspective, but that's up to you. So if you want to articulate something in particular for Lisa, we can. Otherwise, probably not have her come. And then in August, we're looking at Jim Beaver, and I'm still trying to confirm with one of the two possible candidates from FGCU that we've been reaching out to.
I can't do August 11, so, I mean, I can miss the meeting, but
Okay.
I had to change my,
So we have a one missing for August 11th, and it sounded like there may be some issues with July
Yeah, I think
21st also.
I'll be out for July 21st.
And Dave, are you gone for July 21st?
I'm riding an airplane.
What's the group's thoughts? Do we want to go ahead with July 21st, or maybe try to pick a different July date?
I can do a different July
Yeah, I think
date.
we originally talked about the 14th.
14th, yeah.
But I think there was a conflict with the 14th.
I'm out of town 10 through 21 July.
Going someplace nice? Can we join you there? Or?
I was not the scheduler.
Uh-oh.
I mean, do people object if we switch it to the 14th? I mean,
Doesn't
because
matter
it sounds
to me.
like you're going to miss either one, so.
How many are available for the 14th versus the 20th?
I'm fine on the 14th, is fine for me.
I can do the 14th.
Yeah,
I can be here.
okay.
Okay,
Maybe we
so
switch the
we'll
July
move the
date
July
to
to
the
the
14th.
14th. And we'll keep August the 11th, understanding that Tori won't be able to make it, but I'm sure wherever she is, she'll be watching us live on the internet. And
I'm gonna be at the beach.
And John, on the August meeting, I may have a speaker to come talk to us about wells. I won't know about this for a couple weeks yet.
I'll put a question mark.
But, yeah, space holder, please. 15 minutes.
Very good.
And just a reminder, I won't be here at the next meeting.
On the
So-
16th.
Right.
And Nicole will be
Nicole's gonna-
running the meeting.
Yep, perfect.
Good.
All right. Public comment? Anybody with interesting information?
Well, I don't know how interesting.
Love to hear it.
Hi. For the record, I'm Kathy McGrath. Now, some of this has already been discussed, but I just want my comments to be there. I have no financial interest out there. I don't own any property there, but I've had property since 1967 here, and I have followed all this all along. And of course, I'll go on record again saying I was against the moratorium, and I am for a public-private partnership to develop this properly with infrastructure, and it can help pay for the roads. One of the most important things is I'm not in favor of purchasing or taking any private land to have a retention pond, because first of all, it's been tried, it doesn't work, you'd have to line it, and it's just not feasible. I think we should try to use the existing conservation properties. I think we've all agreed on that. Crew, we should encourage and help South Florida Water Management to continue their projects and also to continue purchasing the missing pieces out there, because that is the true protection and replenishment of our drinking water, not this DRGer that you're studying. It's the crew. Brenda said, and she will be here, she said, give me any water you can, I'll take it. So let's try to divert to Crew, to Pine Lake Preserve, to Hidden Cypress. Let's try to, well, we heard the discussion about Jefferson, but let's try to keep the existing flowways open and clear, and look for, again, money. Some kind of solution for maintenance funding for keeping these flowways open and for things like the culverts under I-75 and all. So that's basically it. You kind of covered everything real well, but I just wanted to make my comments known. And I think, I think you're all doing a great job. Okay?
Thank you, Kathy. Anyone else for public comment? All right, seeing none, we're going to adjourn the meeting.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.